Kalorama, a recorded books high-bridge imprint, presents Fridays of Rage, Al Jazeera, the Arab Spring, and Political Islam by Sam Cherribi. Read by Shawn K. Jain. Preface: Arab Revolutions on Demand. The first olive tree on the way south marks the beginning of the Mediterranean region, and the first palm grove the end. Fernand Braudel, 1995. In short, in seeking to improve everything, they ended up creating turmoil everywhere. Alexis de Tocqueville, The Ancient Regime and the French Revolution. On Friday, all honorable Egyptians must come out to give me a mandate to end terrorism and violence. General Abdul Fattah el-Sisi, Al Jazeera, July 24, 2013. You say you want a revolution? Athawra, revolution, revolution. A professor shouted at Bab al-Ahad, a bustling Rabat square where students and visitors from neighboring cities arrive in Morocco's capital by bus and taxi. The professor hoped to stir public outrage that might lead to a spontaneous revolution. This was in 1982, my last year as a student at Rabat's University Mohammed V. It was a period of mass student protests and worker strikes. The memory of the incendiary professor rushed back to me when I arrived in Rabat from Atlanta, just days after the ousting of the Tunisian president Ben Ali, to find Morocco's streets filled with tension. 30 years had passed since the professor's demonstration, which ended, by my recollection, with his arrest. Nobody understood his actions. Was he motivated by despair or a tremendous belief in the power of crowds to ignite an uprising? I firmly believe he was lucid, driven by a desire to put lie to commonly accepted notions about the inability of Arab peoples to shape their own destinies, without the heavy-handed guidance of either domestic or imported autocrats. The act of speaking out was, in itself, a powerful statement. This was an era when anybody who spoke of revolution wound up in jail, was suddenly unemployed, or simply disappeared. The 1980s were the peak of what was termed in Morocco les années de plomb, years of lead. This represented the brutality of the Minister of Interior, Ahmed Basri. The city of Kenitra, where the professor who shouted Athawra came from, was famous for its dissidents and multiple unsuccessful coups d'états. Originating from a former U.S. military base, the city had one of the largest and harshest prisons in Africa, built by the French colonial rulers. The late 1970s and the 1980s were an era of two converging processes, political repression and a piecemeal Arabization that remains incomplete today. The latter process included the dismantling of the institution of French liberal education. Throughout public life, French language was replaced with Arabic. These two processes may have created the conditions for the emergence of political Islam. The repressive tactics and crackdown on leftist activists slowed down secular progress and removed any viable alternative to counter political Islam as an emerging anti-establishment configuration. In eviscerating liberal institutions it saw as a threat, the Moroccan government left in its place a scorched earth, where the seeds of political Islam would grow. The word Athawra, revolution, had been appropriated previously by the Arab regimes that followed post-war independence. There was Thawratul Aruba, revolution of pan-Arabism in Egypt; Thawra al-Hadra, Green Revolution in Libya; Athawrat al-Malik wa Shab, revolution of king and people in Morocco; and Athawra hatta Nasr, revolution until victory in Palestine. The word revolution in the Arab world has had a number of meanings over the years. In order to analyze the revolutionary landscape in the Arab world of the early 2010s, its genesis and its metaphorical, hidden, and overt expressions, we should connect meanings to events as framed by the media and manipulated by political and social actors. There is no one-size-fits-all explanation for the failure of democracy to bear fruit in the Arab world, since not all Arab countries are the same. However, if democratic change continues to founder following the eruption of the Arab Spring, the discontentment and disenchantment will settle into an unstable, potentially explosive situation. Since my departure from Morocco, where I was a student in the 1980s, the country has changed a lot. I left to study in Europe and eventually settled in the Netherlands. In 1994, I became a member of Dutch Parliament, where I served 2 consecutive terms, representing the Netherlands at the Council of Europe, the Assembly of the Western European Union, and the North-South Center at Lisbon. In 2003, I moved with my family to the United States to teach political sociology at Emory University in Atlanta, the city of the dream and the dreamer. I now work closely with the Martin Luther King Center and the Jimmy Carter Center. These institutions serve as a source of inspiration and motivation for my passion for the civil rights movement and democratic movements in developing nations. Despite my travels, I have never entirely left the Arab world. I teach courses on political Islam, media and social movements, and the Arab diaspora. I host frequent guests from Algeria, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Jordan, Israel, Egypt, Tunisia, Sudan, and Mauritania via Skype. In addition to returning frequently to Morocco, I visit countries across the Maghreb, Mashrek, and Khalij. In 2007, I conducted the World Values Survey with Juan Díaz Nicolás of Universidad Complutense de Madrid. During my most recent stay in Morocco, 2 phenomena struck me dramatically. First was the visible Islamization, in terms of clothing and appearance, veils, headscarves, bearded men, and the ubiquitous religious CD/DVD vendors standing behind small aluminum carts, equipped with boomboxes blasting the same Saudi recitation of the Quran. The second striking change in the landscape was the overwhelming number of West African immigrants. Just as northern Mexico serves as the major terminal for traffic between Latin America and the United States, Morocco has become a hub for transferring goods and people between Africa and Europe, with a similarly attendant parallel economy, dominated by narco-culture, passeurs, commonly called coyotes in North America, and haraga, undocumented migrants who wish to enter Europe. The 2 enclaves of Spanish sovereignty on the Moroccan mainland, Ceuta and Melilla, are physically fenced off in order to deter entry by undocumented immigrants. These 2 phenomena are framed systematically in European and Arabic media outlets in a way that stresses the Islamic and African identities of Morocco. But the politics and society of Morocco stem from multiple histories and identities: Berber, Amzigh, Arab, Islamic, Jewish, African, Mediterranean, and European. This book is, of course, not an examination of Moroccan culture. It is a journey through the revolutionary landscapes of the Arab world by means of a deconstruction and decoding of Al Jazeera Arabic's coverage of pivotal regional events. During the revolutions of the Arab Spring, Al Jazeera Arabic provided an instrumental link between the emerging social media activism and multinational satellite television broadcasts. Al Jazeera framed and promoted the term revolution as synonymous with Islamic virtue during the early phases of the Arab Spring. Its cameras continued to roll as revolutions turned to democratic disenchantment, malaise, and willing acceptance of any kind of authority. Looking back, one is left to wonder how things might be different today if Al Jazeera Arabic had been around to cover the Moroccan professor's shouts of Athawra back in the early 1980s. Would the network's coverage of such demonstrations have applied the sort of pressure felt most recently by regimes in Tunisia and Egypt? Al Jazeera has been successfully exerting such pressure since its inception in 1996. What would the Arab world look like now? Would the world have witnessed an earlier Arab Spring? The answer is probably no, since Al Jazeera Arabic itself was a revolution in the Arab media landscape. However, Al Jazeera might have engendered the sorts of feelings of empowerment and self-worth now felt by Arab publics in relation to their rulers. The tangible effect of Al Jazeera's coverage over the past 2 decades has been a sense of unity among Arab publics and an altered media landscape within the Arab world, where static media configurations and silent audiences have given way to dynamic and vocal publics. There has been an undeniable emergence of spin-offs of Al Jazeera. An explosion of media initiatives has crowded the Arab space, with hundreds of new TV outlets attempting to emulate Al Jazeera. Abu Bakr Jamai, an engaged Moroccan journalist struggling for freedom of the press, argues that the novelty of Al Jazeera is its ability to make public debate a normal feature of Arab societies. No single Arab news outlet can count on the loyalty of Arab publics or viewers without producing credible news, rejecting taboos, and being pluralist. However, according to Ahmed Ben Shamsi, a journalist and human rights activist, Al Jazeera did little to change Morocco during the Arab Spring, with its weak coverage of the February 20 movement, in spite of the fact that its coverage before then had outraged Moroccan authorities. And the rest of the Arab countries? Could an act of self-immolation a la Bouazizi, the ambulant fruit vendor in Tunisia who ignited the fire of the Arab Spring, have happened during those years? In order to answer this question, we have to consider 2 points. Al Jazeera contributed to a revolution of the behaviors of Arab publics and an erosion of fatalism in Arab polity. This process did not happen overnight, nor did it occur in a vacuum. It took years alongside contributing trends like globalization, individualization, Islamization, the youth bulge, and the relative democratization processes of the late 1990s. Let's paint a triptych using the Maghreb, Mashrek, and Khalij, the 3 main geographic regions of the Arab world, in order to compare and contrast the different policies toward society that have evolved since the tumultuous 1980s. During those years, 2 important phenomena were observable: authoritarianism and the rise of political Islam. Many riots and acts of resistance took place in and across many countries, but none led to a popular uprising on the scale of the Jasmine Revolution in Tunisia or the revolution in Egypt. Political Islam became a major force of contestation. It emerged on Egyptian university campuses. From Egypt, it spread to Tunisia and Algeria and Morocco. It was a confusing period in the Arab world. In the Maghreb, Gaddafi's ongoing Green Book revolution was promulgated throughout the Arab world by his propaganda machine. Algeria and Morocco waged radio wars of insults against each other over the Western Sahara conflict. Meanwhile, in the Mashrek, Saddam Hussein's newspapers and books were given away for free to students at Iraqi embassies. Lebanon's civil war raged, drawing Syria into the conflict. Jordan cracked down on Palestinian groups. Egypt sunk into decline and isolation. Sudan was in the midst of its own complicated Islamic experience. In the Khalij, the 1973 oil crisis spurred Gulf countries to amplify their funding of Arab extra-parliamentary opposition in European capitals, mainly Paris and London. Islamist opposition efforts with the poor and attempts to influence the networks of the mosques built by North African guest workers in Europe were also beneficiaries of this funding. The cassettes of the Egyptian blind preacher Muhammad Kishk, which Gilles Capel immortalized in his seminal book The Prophet and the Pharaoh, were sold everywhere. The human rights records of Arab countries became more deplorable than ever. The people of the Arab world were in need of freedom. Poverty, birth rates, and illiteracy were high everywhere, with the exception of the oil-rich countries. Youth in the 1980s were torn between political Islam and a vanishing Marxist-Leninist alternative. The only other choice for the youth of North Africa, Maghreb, was migration to Europe. And that for the youth of the Middle East, Mashrek, was migration to the wealthy Gulf countries, Khalij. Migration was a path to survival. Emigration to Europe meant political freedom, while emigration to the Gulf meant the unfreedom and strict norms of Salafi Islam. The long-term effects of emigration were devastating. By the 2010s, émigrés returning home after long sojourns found their home countries unrecognizable, as the secular institutions that had characterized their youths had become largely Islamized. These changes were brilliantly captured by Amin Maalouf in Jain, a novel about an émigré, Adam, who returns to Lebanon after the Civil War and no longer recognizes what once was the Switzerland of the Middle East. Adam is disillusioned by the disappearance of Levantine culture. He feels that the Lebanese people who have stayed in the country have changed, having abandoned their cosmopolitan ideals in favor of narrow and exclusive identities that perpetuate hatred and violence between communities. Living under a brutal Syrian occupation had forced the Lebanese people into a rotten compromise. Similar accounts of Algeria, Iraq, Syria, and the Sudan were written in this period. The shift from secularization to Islamization stupefied one Egyptian, who was shocked to see his country move from the vanguard of Arab modernity, which ranged from movies to music, to the rulership of Morsi and the Veil. The Arab world's university campuses have seen a gradual process of Islamization, which began around the mid-1980s and reached a peak in the 2000s. In January 2011, during Tunisia's Jasmine Revolution, I was invited by Beit al-Hikmah, House of Wisdom, as a keynote speaker for a memorial in Rabat on the anniversary of the death of the Algerian thinker Muhammad Arkoun. I had the chance to visit a number of university campuses during my stay. Islamist student organizations were the dominant social force. An acquaintance at the well-known Engineers Institute of Casablanca complained to me that many of his colleagues are Khwanjia, bearded Islamists. However, it is a sociological reality that Islam is becoming more pronounced as an identity than at any time in the recent past. The Tunisian psychoanalyst Fethi Ben Slama remembers that when he was young in Tunisia, there was a kind of silent religiosity without pronounced expressions in the public space. At that time, one's being Muslim spoke for itself, and there was no need to make overt displays of one's Islamic identity. The gradual Islamization that has taken place over the past decades helped plant the seeds that would eventually bloom into an Islamist victory during the first democratic elections following the Arab Spring. The term Arab Spring, coined first by the European media and thereafter adopted by Al Jazeera, is a reference to the European revolutions of 1848 and 1968. The Arab Spring was a turning point in the valuation of the previously suppressed voices of the Arab street and common people. The Arab Spring marked a significant change in the dialogue between Arab governments and their peoples. The Arab street became, overnight, a potential ally and source of legitimacy for anyone hoping to gain or maintain power. Arab leaders sought to gain and legitimize power through a cycle of popular mobilization and counter-mobilization, revolution on demand. For example, after deposing President Morsi of Egypt, General Abdul Fattah el-Sisi called for mass protests throughout the country in order to obtain a public mandate to squash terrorism. The Muslim Brotherhood, in turn, called for a 1 million-person march and organized sit-ins to break up the military coup. The Al Jazeera superstar preacher Yusuf al-Qaradawi used his pulpit on Al Jazeera to call for protests against Arab regimes in Egypt and Syria. The Moroccan king, Mohammed VI, mobilized the masses to support his referendums. Whether working in a top-down or bottom-up direction, the Arab street became the path to change. Social movements and counter-movements in the Arab world, such as April 6th, Tamarad, Tajarad, and Third Square in Egypt, Egleb, meaning change in Tunisia, the February 20 movement, and March 9th in Morocco, are examples of mass mobilization. This emergence of popular movements at the center of political discourse would have been impossible without the presence of Al Jazeera. The international satellite TV network served as a unifying force for the disparate elements of the unprecedented youth bulge, societal Islamization, and the rise of social media in the Arab world that, once combined, would erupt in the harmonious cries for revolution now called the Arab Spring. By bringing these pieces together, Al Jazeera helped to create a mental predisposition toward revolution in Arab countries. As democratizing movements emerged, including those aligned with political Islam, the network amplified their voices. Al Jazeera pundits like the global mufti al-Qaradawi legitimized popular challenges to the status quo with his impromptu call for the destabilization of Arab regimes. Prickly pears and molinos de viento. The dramatic outcomes of the Arab Spring in Libya, Egypt, and Syria have stoked doubts about the ability of Arab countries to adopt democracy, especially among those who hoped the revolution signaled a move toward Western democracy in the Middle East. For disappointed observers in the West, it is appropriate to note that the challenges faced by Arab peoples are ones that have not been faced in the United States and most of Europe for generations. In the United States and Europe, the political landscape has been lush with democracy for so long that few residents can remember what it is to hunger for the opportunity to have even the slightest influence on their leadership. But, as recent attempts by the West to export popular rule have shown, the seeds of democracy come in many varieties, none of which will flourish uniformly in all soils and climates. We should no more expect a carbon copy of the Netherlands parliamentary system to produce effective rule in Egypt than we would expect an olive crop to flourish in Amsterdam. In Morocco, a complete lack of progress is referred to as chihware, a dry plant in the wind. For any democratic movement to succeed in the Arab world, it must be suited to the unique and challenging political climate of the region. Throughout the Arab Mediterranean, sturdy, prickly hendi bushes, also called the figs of Barbary or prickly pears, flourish in areas where most plants would wither. They survive arid weather and the pounding Middle Eastern sun. They are nearly as resistant to harvest as they are to the elements. Picking the fruit on a windy day can result in prickles piercing the skin or even the eyes. It takes a special bamboo stick to harvest the fruit, piece by piece. Then the prickles have to be washed from the skin of the fruit before they can be handled. Even then, ingesting the hard seeds can lead to constipation. The Arab revolutions, which seemed at first to nourish political and social progress, contained, like figs of Barbary, hardened, stubborn elements that have obstructed the mechanisms for digesting democratic ideas. Remnants of old regimes incite counter-revolutions, while forces of political Islam, having won power, obstruct the mechanisms of continued democracy. These are the hard seeds preventing Arab societies from absorbing the nourishing aspects of their revolutions and discarding the waste of political discord and remnant glut of the previous establishment. Another Moroccan phrase, sertanabag, is used as a sort of subtle curse. Loosely translated, it refers to a dried fruit that is all pit, masked beneath a sweet skin, incapable of satisfying hunger. It is understandable why the remnants of the old regimes would be resistant to being removed from their positions of power. But the Islamist leaders poised to take their places seemed equally slow in adapting to their new role. The Muslim Brothers, despite decades of political organization, were loath to develop the sort of infrastructure that might form the foundation of a self-perpetuating system of governance in Egypt. Instead, the Morsi government administered acts of government, like the short-lived expansion of freedoms and a new constitution, in the same way it might have dispensed figs or dates at the end of Friday prayers. They were small acts of charity, expected to engender devotion. Like a preacher delivering a Friday congregational sermon, the Morsi government seemed content to preach to those Egyptians who supported it, with seemingly little concern for those who did not buy into the new Islamist rule. The return of military rule to Egypt, the continuing bloody war in Syria, and the outflow of refugees fleeing the counter-revolution seemed to sadly confirm the Arab proverb, "One cannot exchange one friend for a better one." The saying itself betrays a kind of fatalism that is common in Arab societies. Yet people across the Arab world have stood up again and again in the past 5 years to demand a change in the status quo. It remains to be seen how these struggles will ultimately play out. But it is clear that voices from the streets and squares of the Maghreb, Mashrek, and Khalij have become far more difficult to silence than that of the professor I saw in Bab al-Ahad all those years ago. One reason for that is the tremendous reach and popularity of Al Jazeera, which served as a mirror to an audience that saw in its reflection a powerful and determined force. Given its power to shape the self-image of an entire region, it is appropriate that we closely examine the motivations, values, and underlying assumptions that go into constructing the portrayal of the Arab world Al Jazeera presents to its largely Arab audience. That is precisely what I have done in this book. My overall intention is to warn against revolutions that are carried out in the absence of shared political and intellectual agendas, and are propagated without charismatic and popular figures, not as Don Quixote did with the windmills. Part 1. Al Jazeera Unites. Chapter 1. Al Jazeera by the Numbers. In January 2011, the world watched as Tunisia's despotic regime was shockingly and decisively overthrown. The global audience held its breath as the so-called Arab Spring spread to Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain, toppling decades-old governments in a matter of weeks. Rather than ushering in a wave of democracy, as many in the West believed would occur, the Arab Spring demonstrated what Al Jazeera termed a forced failure of political Islam, something the young protesters had hardly anticipated. These popular uprisings, deposing some of the most oppressive dictators in the Arab world, cleared the way for a wave of political Islamist groups, ranging from political parties like the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ennahda Party, Tunisia, and the Justice and Development Party, PJD, Morocco, to radically violent and brutal militant groups such as ISIS. The success of Islamist parties in co-opting this burgeoning energy for their own purposes is a central plotline in this book's analysis of Al Jazeera. In just 15 years since its founding in 1996, Al Jazeera, the flagship media network of the Arab world, has ascended to the zenith of the global media market, now reaching 270 million viewers around the world. Its audience is currently larger than that of CNN and the BBC combined. Al Jazeera Arabic, from its origins as a state-sponsored channel, has expanded to become a central pillar of an international media empire. In 2006, the Al Jazeera channel became Al Jazeera Network, after being heralded as one of the world's most popular commercial brands. This expansion included a tremendous effort to reach out to new regions and cultures, not only in Arabic and English, but also in Turkish, Swahili, Balkan, and other languages. Al Jazeera earned unprecedented popularity in the Arab world for its courage in challenging the Arab establishment and its role as a forum for free speech in a landscape defined by dictatorial propaganda. As a result, widely disparate camps, radicals, conservatives, and liberals alike, saw their interests represented in the network's programming. French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu calls this kind of identification with and recognition of the medium, Al Jazeera, the domestication of domination. Al Jazeera succeeded in domesticating or taming widely varied political, revolutionary, and religious expressions, and then fitting them into the format of televised debates. The network gave Islamist leaders and dissidents of various Arab regimes broader access to transnational Arab publics than they could have ever before dreamed of reaching. By providing a competitive forum with obvious appeal to a diverse group of stakeholders, Al Jazeera attained a widespread buy-in to a habitus of Islamized pan-Arab ontology. This method of pushing a political agenda through ostensibly benevolent action is far from a new phenomenon. However, Al Jazeera's creation of an interactive transnational Arabic space was unprecedented in the Arab world, and earned it significant leverage in the cultural interchange that it was itself facilitating. There is a significant body of literature devoted to Al Jazeera's origins and impact on the Arab world. Despite a general agreement in the social sciences literature on the impact of Al Jazeera on the Arab media landscape, the broader cultural influence of the network's efforts remains a subject of debate. On this front, three dominant perspectives can be distinguished. In the first, Al Jazeera is seen as a modernizing force in Arab culture. Mark Lynch, Muhammad El-Nawawi.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?